think we're live.
Yeah. But
Looks good, man. Yeah.
I made this little. This is my
goodness.
new.
It moves.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. What was it that was it Dave Letterman used to say? Them's magic.
Something like that. And
you're a sorcerer, Trip. Wizardry.
Well, I don't see. It moved all so quickly. I'm not so. If you are joining live, this is going to get cut out of the podcast. But I made this little countdown thing. Look at that. There we go.
That is hella cool, man. I love it. You are getting closer and closer to being a plausible megachurch pastor every day, Trip.
Oh,
it's really impressive. I have to tell you.
It's exactly what I wanted to hear.
That's right. And hello to Ken Haynes. Great to see you hopping in. Lori, thanks for joining us. We have 32 seconds of tomfoolery before Trip's going to get very serious and go into his pastor voice, which gets very
annoying. Oh yeah. Hi, Aaron.
Hello, Trip.
Yeah.
That's right. Lori, don't compliment him too much on his graphics. He'll just go nuts and then start doing his pew, 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 pew stuff.
Oh, don't worry.
Is one of his favorite moves.
Yeah. Everyone loves a good air horn. All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with my buddy Aaron Simmons. And, we're going to do whatever happens when you are a nerd and think about our flourishing democracy.
That's right.
There's your air horn.
And that's clearly the way to start it off. That's right. So if we had some sort of, deathmatch speed round, winner take all of democratic life, that's the way to do it. Well done.
Yeah. Well,
great to be with you again, Trip. Thanks as always for inviting me on, and looking forward to talking to you about stuff that I'm actually, all the times we've done podcasts together, I don't think we've ever really dove into political theory. So pretty stoked to see how that goes.
Well, we'll find out if you should have been stoked or not over the next hour.
And we may go running quickly back to safer Kierkegaardian fare. That's right.
Well, maybe before we jump in, and the way we're going to kind of structure this is Aaron's been teaching a new class for himself, like one he's been putting together as a chance to think through a host of different political questions, engaging different philosophers, thinking about democracy and such. And so he sent me 3 different thinkers and a takeaway from their thought and a cool quote. I made slides. So we're going to use those to make sure we stay on track.
And for anybody who's watching or listening, what that means is that Tripp is going through constant withdrawal from his systematic theology classes back in graduate school, where systematic theology, for anybody who doesn't know, is just theology with charts. Ooh. And so that's effectively what Tripp has turned radical political theory into today, is a systematic theology with charts.
Well, we'll see how they go. We'll see how they go. Do you want to? I think you sharing a bit about the origin story for the class. Give us a little short intro for that, and then we can jump into the takeaways that you've you want to raise after thinking about this conversation.
I'm not even sure I have takeaways yet, but I certainly have some questions that hopefully lead to some sort of robust political life. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron Simmons, professor of philosophy at Furman University, and I also have a Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. Would love for you to come check me out over there, and then a YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. So part of what motivated this conversation between Tripp and I was the fact that in the fall, I was scheduled to teach a class this spring that is this lovely thing that some universities have, which are called shell courses. And so it's basically, in my case, Philosophy 370, figures, movements, or problems. So effectively, anything that might plausibly count as philosophy, you can teach on a sort of, one course model. And then if you want to keep it going, you have to go through a bunch of hoops and a bunch of committees in order to make it permanent. So I have this standing course assignment every couple of years that is this shell course. And my plan was to do something about philosophy of trust, which I enjoy thinking about, and questions of epistemology and how that maybe relates to deconstruction. But then in November, Trump got reelected. And to be honest, I wasn't sure how to see my way out of a paper bag or to take 3 steps without wanting to punch walls. And so I decided to make my class this spring an invitation for myself to think through the kinds of questions about the fate of democracy or what we do in light of challenges to democracy. So the class is called Radical Political Theory. And the first half of the course, which is really what Tripp and I are going to talk about today, is what would it look like to rethink democracy to respond to the kind of challenges that it faces today, right? And then the second half of the course is what might come after democracy. If democracy fails, what are the kind of other alternatives? And Tripp and I have been bouncing ideas around for a while about, well, what should be our next kind of 6-week online pop-up learning community? And so I was saying, dude, let's do radical political theory because these are questions that really matter to me. I don't know if I've got good answers, but I think I have a better sense of the stakes. And so what happened was, hey, let's get together and chat about a few of the big ideas, see what the audience likes, what they want to hear more about. And so we're eager to hear what you guys have to say about the conversation we're going to have together, because it might lead to some more and longer and more extended conversations about these ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, well, here we go. Here we go. Ted wants to know why I was wearing a Twins cap. I got it at the Twins game. When Elgin and I went to the Twins game, I was giving a lecture up in Minneapolis. We went to the Twins game. I liked the hat. And it was yellow, which then if I'm going to wear something that it matches with the yellow,
Nice.
I don't have an American League attachment, I'm a free agent. Just Dodgers and then other things.
I'm barely a fan of baseball at all. I think it takes way too long.
Jeez.
Mm-hmm.
We're next time, patience.
That's right.
All right. So the first theme was talking about sustaining democracy.
Yeah.
And you said that there's a dilemma at the heart of democracy, such that there is a tension between the commitments of a political equality and social justice. As a result, polarization becomes almost inevitable as we strive to stand against those that we see as unjust, and yet, in doing so, ignore their equality as participants in social democracy.
Yeah, that's a bunch of fancy words. So the idea here comes from a good friend of mine, Robert Talese, who is a longtime influential voice in contemporary democratic theory, philosopher at Vanderbilt. And he wrote a really cool book called Overdoing Democracy, which came out a few years ago. And the whole idea was we're all just so exhausted by the fact that politics is the only mode of engagement, the only discursive practice. Every single area of our life is infused and overwhelmed by this political tension, political exhaustion. And so he, in that book, kind of suggests the only way that we can have a flourishing democracy is to stop making politics all-consuming. So how do we not overdo politics? And then he wrote this follow-up book, Sustaining Democracy, where the argument is, in order not to overdo politics, we've got to understand the stakes of what it looks like to exist in democratic society. And the idea is that we face a tension that leads to the very kind of polarization that we see so heavily in our contemporary world. And he tries to diagnose that tension as between these two commitments: political equality, which is just the idea that I recognize each other adult in my society as morally and epistemically valuable in the same way I understand myself. This means that even if I disagree, I recognize their equality, their legitimacy to speak, their plausible rightness. These have to be part of how I engage each other in a democratic space. But the problem is I'm also committed to social justice, because if I don't think that there's a vision of the good as instantiated in public life, then it's not clear what we're talking about in the first place or why we're trying to disagree with each other and what does it matter. And so part of what he suggests is, if we really care about political equality, it seems like we've got to engage and take seriously and give space for voices of people that we see as actively unjust and threats to the very, flourishing of our democratic context. So how is it that we can navigate this space? And his argument is, well, we right now are doing so really badly. So we think that justice requires that I not listen to these voices or I shut down these perspectives because they're a threat. But in doing that, the other perspective sees me as being anti-democratic, and now I'm a legitimate threat to the process of democracy that they take to also demand a different vision of social justice. And then on we go. The more isolated I become in my community, because I don't want to be corrupted and engage these problematic, unreasonable people, the more my own community becomes insular and isolated and then more extreme. And the more extreme my own community gets, the more willing we are to take risks, and the more dangerous we look to the people we think are so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And then we end up in this just radical polarization that creates an inability for democracy to flourish in light of that tension that is perpetual, right? And that's what he's trying to invite us to rethink.
So one of the things that comes to mind in just thinking about this particular challenge is is really the way our current society, kind of the speed of society and the demands on stability in a system that kind of requires growth and then given one's political ideology, progress, even though they could, that desire for justice, there could be contrary energy, but there's a sense of like this desire for justice and how our context problematizes democracy, because it seems that democracy isn't just taking a position, and this is something that we often miss over, I think, in our current way the political landscape plays out culturally. But democracy is the art of taking, forming, listening, reforming solutions across difference, and it's a deliberative process. And I think that part of our current context is that politics has become a performative one.
That's right.
And so those are cross purposes. So that's one feature that makes the question of sustaining democracy difficult. And the other are these questions of scale that I'm kind of interested in how you see, right? Like we could imagine, like thinking of how we get different social incentives for listening. But one of the other elements is that our own time, the time needed for democratic decision making is increasing as the world becomes more complex. It moves faster, it's more dynamic, and so there are more things to take in account. There's more perspectives and voices to listen to if you're moving in a democratic way. So that makes a kind of sense where our growing cultural diversity and our increasing detachment from kind of a monologic of traditional past means that we have no dominant expression that's, like in some ways like gatekeeping or normalizing the discourse. So when you can't assume much, right, when everyone's listening and speaking, that puts an increasing demand upon democratic consensus. And so that kind of scale of response time, at the same time you're scaling up the number of inputs, voices, experiences that matter. In the other scale bit is our decisions have a longer and more irreversible horizon. So like genetic engineering, nuclear stuff, AI, so many of the things that we're facing are even challenges that the horizon's bigger as our deliberation process needs to increase to do it well. And then the boundaries of our political discourse at the nation state don't match up to the challenges we face. So like when I'm thinking of just how sustaining democracy can be pretty difficult, it like a kind of retrieval of something in the past seems to miss a number of these features that are doing this escalation and tribal ratcheting.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's important to understand that for all the thinkers we're going to talk about today, and this is part of why I clumped them together both in the class and then also for our time on this podcast, is they all think that democracy is undermined if the real goal is some sort of consensus that appeals to universality across all participants. And they're all going to suggest that the constancy of that tension of engaging those with whom we disagree, being pushed back on, having our own assumptions challenged, not being able to rest easy, even when it seems like certain things are obvious to my tribe or my group. Part of what is important, says Talise, and then Chantal Mouffe and Simon Critchley, who we'll talk about in a little bit, is they all think the real power of democratic life is a kind of ideality. So it's not that democracy is voting practices and particular forms of social governance. It's also that, right? That's what it is for political scientists. But for these political philosophers, democracy names the never-ending demands of what we might call the political as part of what constitutes us as beings in the first place. I cannot overestimate the obviousness of the evidence that I claim for the views I hold. And the best way to be challenged in that overestimation or that epistemic failure is by engaging people who think my evidence is really weak, right? But at that moment, it's real problematic to then say, oh, so I should engage with people as interlocutors and in good faith, but people who I think are ruining society, leading us down these disastrous paths, which seem almost fixed, as you say, like certain decisions become almost irreversible because they create new norms. And so shouldn't I rage against this, fight against this, not compromise with this? But when I do that, then Talise is saying the worry is that now my own in-group starts policing itself because we don't have these big, deep agreements like we thought we once did, though all these thinkers suggest we never actually had them. We've always had this tension. It's just that we at various spots did a better or worse job of being able to navigate, that play. And so what would it look like if I no longer can have real good standards for social discourse writ large? Well, then I'm going to start kicking out the posers in my own communities, right? You're only one of us if. And Kendrick last night did, I think, one of the most incredible moments of social commentary, at least since Gojira's performance at the Olympics. And the track, They Not Like Us, is a fantastic kind of enclave of thinking about the way that we tend to fall into a sort of Carl Schmittian model of discourse. We, them is the fundamental category. Part of what Talise, Mouffe, and Critchley are going to suggest is we, them is the wrong category. It's the attempt to care about truth in a society that institutionalizes the importance of seeing each other as equals while we struggle for what will count as true requires us to see them as part of what makes us us. We need them as a motivational force for preventing us from becoming the worst versions of ourselves. And that's a real hard ask. And I'll make it very, very personal. There's a person with whom I am acquainted. Facebook calls him a friend, but I don't think that's the right term since I've read too much Aristotle. And this guy is a megachurch pastor on Trump's transition team, was in the Oval Office this week, hands laid on Trump, praying for the new kind of faith partnershipy thing, which is effectively just Christian nationalism now with a whole lot of institutional support. And increasingly, I see this person as not only unreasonable as a participant in social discourse, but as an active threat to everything that I'm trying to teach my son and think matters for democratic engagement.
Yeah.
So do I keep engaging with him in ways that I think model the kind of political disagreement that we need? Or do I just push block because he's no longer someone with whom conversation is possible? And if I do the latter, which believe me, I want to do most days, have I failed at my own commitment to the equality I'm trying to stand for, right? that tension is the thing that Talise brings out and invites us to have to face up and wrestle with. And for me, that's the way in which our own complacency and then delimiting of our own communities and kicking out the posers who aren't like us might end up fostering the very worst selves we can be, and invites the other, the them, to see us now as legitimately the threat that they've claimed we were to begin with, right? Are
Yeah.
we not ratcheting up and actually justifying this problematic reading? And that's kind of where I sit. I don't have a good answer yet.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine then when you're reading the book, and he says that this book is about the challenge of upholding the kind of political relations appropriate among democratic citizens amid political struggles involving opponents whose views strike us as misguided, ignorant, and even repugnant. You
Yep.
know, and
That's tough.
I can think of a little more intense way of saying the same thing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, man. I
Yeah.
just genuinely don't know what it means to think that it's obvious how to proceed, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of where I'm at when it comes to my own political thinking right now. I know what I think justice looks like, but I need people to help me if I've gone wrong. And I also know the kind of deliberative engagement that my profession and my field and, friends of mine take seriously. But is it the case that engaging in that mode of discourse comes at the cost of my notion of justice?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it that my commitment to justice requires me to somehow find a way to engage deliberatively with people that I find repugnant? Like that, I'm stuck right there right now, and inviting others to think with me and us about what that might look like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's and people notice the three moves here kind of ratchet up the crisis in democracy each time. So if
Great.
it, if we can't even figure it out what to do with our Facebook friends,
Yeah.
then it's getting to this kind of paradox of democracy, where you said that any attempt to reach a third way consensus model of liberal democracy forgets that the key values of liberal freedom and democratic popular sovereignty are going to be in tension.
Yep.
As such, the goal is to transform antagonistic enemies into agnostic adversaries.
Well, not agnostic, you theologian, agonistic.
Oh,
But
jeez.
yes.
Yes.
That's okay. That's a great Freudian slip, a Fullerian slip. I like it.
Yes. It makes more sense, though. I was sitting there going, agnostic adversaries. I was like,
Well, so the idea here is, again, this is moving from Talise, who is deeply inspired by a kind of liberal project, though for real sophisticated scholars, we would say he's kind of a interestingly post-liberal in his political conception, but he's still trying to help us think about what would it mean to still see the other people as rational within this broader frame of equality grounded in our shared humanity. And as Linda points out, no, the pastor doesn't care what I think about him. He's called me everything from a heretic to anathema to a deception, a distortion, that I'm ruining children, all kinds of good stuff. But the point is, regardless of what he thinks, do I think that the engagement of equality is in fact also somehow a manifestation of a kind of justice? And so this paradox emerges by turning from Talise to a woman named Chantal Mouffe. Some people who actually read this stuff will be aware that Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau made a really big splash back in the 80s talking about hegemony and socialist strategy was kind of their big proposal and big book. But what she suggests is liberalism and democracy are the two things at odds. So for Talise, we get this sense of equality and justice. Mouffe wants to tweak it, and I like the way she does this and says we tend to think about liberal democracy as if that's the only option, that democracies are liberal and liberal societies are democratic. And she says, no, liberal philosophy is fundamentally committed to the idea of anti-tyranny, right? It is a commitment to the agency of the individual. Freedom is the hallmark. This is why we see in our liberal society things like freedom of press, at least used to be, and freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. These are all liberal commitments. But democracy, she says, is effectively the belief in popular sovereignty, regardless of how we then structure the society or value freedom within it. And so if you've got popular sovereignty, definitionally, the majority will override some of the freedoms of those who wish we would do things differently. And that tension she sees as ultimately a tension between the right and left, because you've got liberty, and in this case, popular sovereignty being a kind of equality. It's not that one rejects one and one embraces the other. It's which do you think is the condition for which?
Yeah.
Is it that popular sovereignty and equality occasions thinking about liberty productively? Or is it that liberty is sacrosanct, and then we can conceive of what that looks like as, members of an equality society, right? So for MOVE, that tension means any attempt toward consensus is to violate the very stakes of the political that constitute our shared social lives. We can't eliminate the left-right divide. We've got to make possible the left and the right as mutually constitutive. And she draws on Derrida and his notion of the constitutive outside in order to do this, right? The us-them is not now destroy the them. It's the us needs the them to make sure that we don't become a them that we wish we weren't. And that tension makes real decision possible as we move not towards justice that is finally instantiated, but a justice that is always to come, as Derrida says. There's never a complacency that we can rest easy about having done it right. The tension continues.
Yeah, and I think here, the thinking about our current moment, and you can tell me if there are more that popped in your head when as you've been going through these texts with students, but that tension between the freedoms that liberalism protects and the power of the population, it seems that there are a number of current kind of dynamics within the populace that are degrading or degenerating the democracy. And one are the way class tensions and inequality work out. And that ends up relating to what kind of agency the non-elites have, the loss of the efficacy of citizenship and voice, right? And we can see some of this in the migration of middle and working class people to vote on behalf of cultural resentment rather than material conditions or advancing.
Well, and this is Moof's whole prediction is when you end up in a situation where it's all about consensus, and she's talking about Bill Clinton and Tony Blair as like the great models of that kind of third way politics. She says pretty soon what's going to start happening is the extremes, the boundaries, the marginal, right, in that space will start seeing this as not representative of their interests, of their participation, of their voices. And it does become, as Don says, right, a tyranny of the majority, because it's popular sovereignty at the cost of liberty in that way. So what she says is right-wing populists will emerge. And similarly, though, left-wing movements that are now also insular and rejecting the very stakes of discourse start to emerge. And so you end up with a kind of demagoguery, but we only tend to recognize it in one direction because, again, our vision is those guys are the threat. And that is where we end up in a very problematic space. And so we often hear, we've carved out the center. There's no center anymore. We've got to get back to centrist. We've got to find ways to collaborate. And they're not suggesting that's a bad idea. They're just suggesting that collaborative engagement does not mean meet in the middle and ignore the marginal voices. It's no, let the left really be the left. It's kind of like Hauerwas, right? Where he says we need the world to be the world for the church to be the church. She's effectively saying you need the right to be the right and be good at it rather than bonkers and ignorant and frustrating and self-interested. And you need the left.
Hypothetically,
you need the left to be the left. but not just rhetorically and complacently and, through a kind of self-congratulatory activism. You need real materiality coming into contrast with each other so that we can invite voices always to challenge whatever emerges as the popular sovereign.
Yeah.
That has to be interrogated as constitutive of the very deliberative engagement in the first place.
Yeah. So if we have that tension, the class tension inequality element problematizing this, then Don's point is that there is that tension between kind of the freedom of liberalism and the process of democracy. There's also that challenge of majoritarianism, where there's an asymmetrical power between sides, and so and there that's a space where things like direct action and such become, I would say, like a more positive way of venting that energy. But the other part that I am seeing in the present, I don't know if the thinkers you've been reading would name this as its own, but it seems to me that there's a variety of re-narrations of ethno-nationalism, right? There's, and this is a thing about America in ways that are even different than other Western democracies. We're constantly re-narrating the story of who we the people are, right?
That's right.
And that re-narration comes with a kind of new normative powers of relations. So the new narrative of we the people post Obama, right, set up where the inertia of that narrative made little tension to the introduction of DEI into the economic sphere, into the way the government legislated things and such. That's there. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is the way the power of that narrative is something that is symbolically binding and orienting for the people. And when a proposition is being told, not where it's like, there's no blue states or red states. That is obviously naive, but it's also gesturing one direction in a very different way than I am your retribution, right? And
there is no third way anything in Trumpist political life. So we have moved from the third way consensus that they all diagnosed as problematic to the very thing that they prophesied would emerge, which is the populist uprising that becomes authoritarian and autocratic as a result of that very marginalizing without hospitality.
Yeah. And so here's one of the zinger quotes you pulled. I'm convinced, contrary to the claims of third way theorists, that the blurring of the frontiers between left and right, far from being an advance in a democratic direction, is jeopardizing the future of democracy. So can you, we'll unpack it just a bit, but how does observing that this second tension that you're raising change the way you think about engaging, right? Your Facebook friend. Before.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not sure it changes. It just, I think, raises the stakes of why it matters to wrestle with it, right? So part of what Muff is trying to suggest is that whenever we think the goal, and here she's critical for some listeners who might be aware of this backstory, here she's critiquing the inheritance coming out of the deliberative democracy tradition of, in particular, Habermas and post-Rawlsian political thought. And what they suggest in various ways is there's some universal standard by which we can engage each other. And if given enough time and the right kind of procedural structures, we will all agree about what justice looks like. For Rawls, we will agree that fairness has been achieved and therefore justice is enacted, even if our personal interests might not cut in the direction that we have chosen. We all still consent at this deep level to the fairness of the praxis and the procedure. For Habermas, we just engage in ideal deliberative scenarios, and we recognize that reason giving functions, again, as this kind of abstract principle fully instantiated in practice such that the product of deliberation will necessarily then guarantee a kind of justice. So what she's suggesting is all of that ignores what she calls the political, which is this antagonistic reality whereby there is an us them that cannot be eliminated. We don't all get to say, well, we were us them until we engaged behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. We engaged in the ideal deliberative strategies. She's saying, no, it's an us them all the way down. But the us them doesn't have to be a antagonistic enemy engagement, where then, because you're engaging an enemy, the goal is elimination. But if you're engaging agonistically with an adversary, the point becomes, look, I mean, my goodness, every beer camp I've ever been at, it's not that everybody agrees on stage and it's this big fest of unitary visions. It's lots of perspectives that have nuance in where they really do disagree. And the point is, the adversarial engagement sometimes bubbles up and becomes visible, but it shows up in a way that actually invites everyone there, not to take sides and do battle, but to realize it turns out that there's more than one reasonable place you could stand. And therefore, justice is always going to be more complicated than we thought. And that's the move that she's trying to do, is say, when we think that we could just come to some sort of consensus, blur the left and right, everyone meet in the middle, and we're going to have this, kumbaya moment, democracy fails, because what that does is invites the demagogue who then claims to speak for the forgotten, those who have been left out of the rigged system, those who in fact have been ignored by the corporate elites, right? And that, wait a minute, that's what we've heard from Trump from the beginning. So what that looks like is the reemergence of the Schmittian version of politics. Get rid of them, operate out of fear, rather than recognizing the complicated and never-ending process that is a democracy trying to overcome the constitutive failures in relation to some of its participants.
Yeah.
And that's where I think you're right. The class move is going to be a way of thinking about it. And MOOF is in some ways trying to bring Marxism into conversation with democratic practice in a way that isn't anti-democratic or anti-liberal. She says we've got to have both, and then paying attention to the way that class causes us to be bad as liberals and Democrats is something we've got to do better at moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question, and this is something that shows up regularly because of, just interacting with thousands of ministers via podcasting classes and such, is that she's raising up that there is this temptation to deny tension, right?
Right.
And that's actually
the political.
Right. It's undermining
the political.
The denial of the temptation to deny tension actually undermines the efficacy of the political engagement and the democratic process.
That's right.
And it makes me think of the weird description a clergy at a purple church generates. Because the thing they're allergic to, partially for their employment, but you can see there, right, that the tension's the problem. If we could figure out a way for whatever the minority position is at the church to be comfortable here while the majority is going to do what they want, we're going to take the lead. Maybe we won't be as aggressive here. We'll wordsmith this and the ambiguity, but we're sitting here trying to avoid tension. And one of the things that comes to the fore when you do that is that the repression of tension is actually a repression of freedom and a kind of undermining of the deliberative process that's necessary. And I think that there are two things that, even when we think of the kind of deliberation that takes place within a religious tradition, as to its own self-understanding in any context, history, moment, and such. There's one way of using, say, the creeds or the canon and go, oh, okay, well, these are boundary markers and they function to say what's in or out. But then if you know the history of what got into canon or how the creeds were developed and then extended, they are boundary markers, but they're also creating space, right?
Yeah,
So you
that's
canonize
right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and
That's right.
they have very different understandings of the person of Jesus, and they're still not as radically different as Paul's, except it's canonized, right?
Yep.
We have a creed that the Christological controversies create all these things we add lines onto, but then when it goes to explaining how the humanity and divinity work, it's like
Hmm.
we're going to invent a word
That's
and
right. That's
move
right.
on, right? And so to me, one of the things that like one of the possibilities, even just looking at our own religious tradition, is that there is a sense that that one of the results of the tension is actually creating both a spaciousness where you belong in your diversity.
Yep.
Like Mark gets to go at the end of the gospel and go, I don't know, they didn't tell anyone, they were freaked out.
Hmm.
And then John's just like, when Jesus was on the cross, he's like, this junk is finished. Cosmos, logos, eat it. Um, and there's boundaries of like the boundaries are being made to make space for that tension to be worked
Yeah,
out. Anyway,
exactly
that
right.
was an
No,
analogy I was thinking
I
of.
I love it because my mind does not go there. Like as a matter of course, I tend to think about these things in ways that don't pull us into religious discourse because I tend to think that it complicates. But I love the way that you're offering that as an example. And in fact, I want to plug a book of a friend of mine on that topic. It's
Uh-oh.
called Writing, get it right, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels by James Barker. Just came out, and hopefully he'll be on Homebrewed soon and other podcasts in the near future because he's amazing, amazing, amazing scholar. But his whole point is the Gospels themselves are a constant task of
Mm,
being rewritten insofar as how we make sense of them. Like what hermeneutics we even bring to them change what it is that they have always been. And this task of writing and rewriting is part of what I would suggest the deconstruction philosophers that I read and take so seriously have helped us understand about all of our cultural norms, all of our social practices, and even all of our linguistic utterances, right? And so part of what we're watching right now is, I think, the diminution of what it looks like to be able to engage as a way of making better the things that we take seriously, right? And so we've got some questions, people saying, well, does the two-party system make it worse or better? It might look like two parties is great because now you've got clear alternatives. But what ends up happening is the two parties often end up just being unhelpful versions of what the middle might be,
yeah.
rather than understanding, no, you need genuine challenge, genuine critique. And one of the um, deepest disappointments. I had all kinds of frustrations with Biden, both policy wise and then strategically in his choice to run again. But what disappointed me as much as anything else, if not more, was when it started looking like there was this everyone needs to rally behind him because that's what loyalty demands. And it was like, oh, good God, that's the very thing
Yeah.
that is rightfully contestable in the Trumpist space, is this kind of idolatry of consensus. And if you're challenging, if you're critical, if you're speaking up, if you're saying, but what about what you're doing is actually showing yourself to be a poser who's not really one of us. And in doing this, now we've watched, right? Lots disaffected from the left. I think, his poor handling of the Gaza situation, obviously, the genocide occurring caused him lots of disaffection from the left. But when the only options is, well, disaffected and frustrated, or participating, but maybe even at the cost of one's own commitments, well, what do we do? And this brings us to the third thinker
Yeah.
and book that I want to talk about,
Well, can
infinitely
I add
demanding.
one
Yeah,
thing on that? That I mean, and just as an example of even Biden handling that and Harris, like at the DNC, they wouldn't allow a 2-minute speech by someone advocating for
exactly.
Palestine who was going to endorse her.
Exactly.
Right. So
Exactly. because you don't want to lose the consensus. Don't lose the middle.
Yeah, because Trump's worried about all the people
Yep.
disagreeing with him.
Yep.
He's real threatened by the diversity.
Well, and he's better. I mean, you'll not hear me say he's good at much. He is better at Schmittian politics.
Yeah.
He is better at recognizing fear really motivates. The problem is you've got to have fear of like existential weight. My goodness, the account of the left from Trumpist America is they're mutilating your children. They're going to, assault people in bathrooms. They're coming after your Bibles. They're going to get rid of your houses and homes and jobs, right? Well, shoot. If that's even kind of true, you've now motivated radical loyalty because, as Agamben and others and Schmidt himself will talk about, the sovereign's the one who claims emergency situations and therefore gets to suspend the normal operations of deliberative engagement. And so what's the left do? Well, they also tried to talk about fear and be scared of the big bad other, but they're doing it as this is going to ruin democracy. But the problem is democracy is already so abstract that it's never going to have that traction. People are saying, my goodness, my family's getting bombed, and you're worried about some status quo maintained that actually is not really addressing the real material conditions and historical marginalization of bodies. So the left has not been as good at understanding the motivational power of the Schmittian dichotomy.
Yeah.
The problem is they've also not been very good. We've not been very good at articulating what genuine agonism would look like that doesn't demotivate engagement. And that's where Simon Critchley says we've got active and passive nihilism taking over because we have a motivational deficit in our liberal democratic society. Active nihilism, that's the right. Blow this stuff up. Let Doge come through. Tear it all down, right? You get this kind of weird accelerationism of the right. Passive nihilism is all of my friends thinking there's nothing. What can we do? It's exhausting. That's just, I guess, hang out with each other. And the idea is, how do you avoid the passive nihilism of disengagement and the active nihilism of radical, unjust warfare? Well, maybe what's required is some model of what we could call a kind of ethically motivated theory of the political subject, where what it is we do as members of deliberation, as members of society, is grounded in an ethical identity that doesn't require agreement about big metaphysical propositions or religious commitments or universal structures like we saw in traditional liberalism. And that's what Critchley's trying to offer as a kind of way forward, so we can have real critique, real dissensus rather than consensus, by rethinking who we are.
Mm. And I think the naming the kind of polarity of nihilism is important. And that is it emerges as a real cultural power in late modernity. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
not that is not a contextual challenge for for us until relatively recently.
Yeah.
The way you kind of summarized the Critchley's thesis, you said that liberal democracy suffers from a motivation deficit that's fostering fundamentalisms and populisms in ways that threaten to slide society into authoritarian directions. What is needed is a theory of ethical selfhood by which we can motivate political change, political critique in justified ways.
Right.
Can you talk about what are philosophers talking about when they discuss selfhood and the good?
Yeah. So in this case, what Critchley's trying to do is challenge the liberal model of selfhood that underlies both Talese's account and Mouffe's critique, right? They're basically suggesting that traditionally political selfhood has been grounded in this sense of, and here I'm cribbing John Rawls, free, equal, independent, and mutually disinterested society members, right? Like what it is to be a political individual, what it is to be a self, is to be grounded in this discourse that we would call rights language. I bear rights. Well, what is the self? The unit that bears rights, that can have these predicates of life, liberty, and happiness. Well, there's a lot that recommends this, right? Because what it's trying to do is say there's something sacrosanct about each and every other person that cannot be eliminated via discourse about groups and social connections. That this is Levinas, the other cannot be fully subsumed into any social category. Rawls calls this non-moral identity markers. The non-moral social categories, as important as they are for all kinds of real things in our lives, there's something else deeper than that. But notice that deeper than in traditional liberal discourse has been radically individualistic. And what Critchley suggests, which he's reading the same kinds of thinkers that is Mouffe and responding to the same thinkers to which Talisse is responding, he says, Critchley, we need not an individual, but we need a dividual, a self divided at its core, because what it is to be me is not bearing rights and you get off my lawn and we figure out how then to navigate this kind of social arrangement by which our property narrates our selfhood. Instead, let's think about my assent, or what he'll call affirmation, approval, is a response to the demand placed on me by each and every other. And so the idea is I am a political entity, a political self, insofar as I recognize demand from others, right? For time, for space, for attention, for, challenge. And I give or don't give approval to those demands in concrete situations. So when somebody says, hey, US aid is inefficient, we've got to change the structure. Well, that's a demand being made upon me as a member of society in which taxpayer funds are going to support this institution. Some can respond and say, yes, shut it down. They're approving that demand. Others, like myself, would say, whoa, the call for oversight at the level of thinking deeply about how can we be more effective at helping the very marginal of the globe, that sounds smart. Let's get better at that. But shutting this down will actively cause the suffering and death of the poorest in the world as a result of our arrogance. I do not approve. Notice that tension, which we saw in Talisse between this dynamic of equality and justice, we saw in Mouffe between liberty and sovereignty. We now see between a kind of necessity of demand and then a disagreement about where our approval should be given. So we are, says Critchley, fundamentally ethical, but that doesn't require a theory of the good about which we all agree, right? We are oriented towards some notion of the good, and therefore we are not self-sufficient. Our individuality is not the basis of our political life. Our obligation, our responsibility, and our mutual concern is. And he thinks that has a much stronger secular motivation than any of this stuff that we've been handed from our liberal tradition.
Yeah, and I haven't read Critchley's political philosophy, but I've read a number of his other books, and I wonder if there's a connection here between the way he critiques the politics of recognition. When we think of how the dominance of identity politics for animating and motivating sides and cultivating resentment towards the other, underneath it is this place where you don't have that shared concept of the good that a culture has in a tradition, that now the individual, the liberal subject individual in their freedom tells you who they are, and it imposes on you a kind of a moral demand to recognize their own authoritative access to themselves, right? And
Yeah,
so, be it, and you can see how this plays out with all the identity politics stuff. And one
absolutely.
of the things that that he problematizes there isn't the desire for people to be recognized in their uniqueness. It's
Hmm.
that the site of recognition is the collective. And
Right.
when it's framed on the individual, then your own self testimony of who I am, how I understand myself, is experienced by the other as a demand
Hmm.
where their own valuation or interpretation of what you're asserting gets roughshod over.
That's
And
right.
when the task of recognition isn't kind of located in this kind of hyper individualism of a kind of enlightenment notion of the self, but
Yeah.
we make those boundaries of the self more porous and collective, then then you have the possibility of the good of collective
Hmm.
recognition
That's right.
without the demand for sameness, or one person gets to give the one final account of something, which seems as you could see the way that connection, which he does in other contexts, resonates with
Hmm.
what's going on here, and actually
Right.
allows that it becomes a way of asserting the good without the wanting to deny the tension, that
Right.
we just talked about.
Yeah, and his answer for like what this looks like when played out is really interesting. So, drawing on Levinas, and you gave a great synopsis of kind of what that would look like without the name dropping. Basically, he says liberalism as an ontology or as a theory of the good itself and of selfhood, it's archic, right? It's foundationalist. It's this is the thing and beyond which no other. And he says, no, what ethics is an anarchic or without foundation, without good, easy origin story, an anarchic meta politics. So, what we do in this kind of anarchic practice, and so he's talking about anarchism as a kind of deeply democratic mode of existence, is we refuse to allow the state to be the site of democratic engagement.
Yeah.
And he talks about an interstitial space where you've basically got real political action happens outside of state power, but within the context by which that power functions.
Hmm.
And so he talks about things like humor, right? Which I would suggest, the Daily Show, especially since Jon Stewart's come back, I got to admit, I'm a fan of the way he does stuff, is a kind of site of this sort of anarchic challenge, but it's occurring precisely internal to the space where that challenge can exist and be countenanced. And so that's the problem is Trump, I mean, reasonably, though horrifyingly, is getting rid of spaces where that kind of anarchy can occur. Because Make America Great Again is this foundationalist discourse. And if you challenge this, you're not only challenging what America is, but you're challenging the very idea of selfhood. So you hate freedom. You're not patriotic. So instead of a patriotic engagement with alterity being a kind of anarchic resistance,
Hmm.
we're left with a loyalty test model of reinforcing the status quo as the only game in town. And so, what it looks like to, and this is really sexy, what it looks like to then resist on Trumpist models is to just support oligarchs as, in fact, somehow outsiders, right? Notice the perversity of that inversion. It's
Hmm.
horrifying, and yet it's brilliant on this Critchelian model because it's eliminated interstitial spaces. The only space is as threat, get rid of the liberals, get rid of the left, own the libs, or as insiders who are now narrating themselves as the only ones who really understand what's going on. And so the state becomes the very authority structure of its own disruption. But it's not actually disruptive. What it's doing is now just reinforcing the very thing that needed contested, right? So this is why Critchley is so powerful to me. I disagree with some of the psychoanalytic framing he gives, etc. But I love this idea that political resistance is grounded in an anarchic notion of selfhood, whereby obligation is deeper than our theory of selfhood on the liberal model. And I think that's really something we should think through.
Yeah. Yeah. So the line from Critchley you pulled out is, at the heart of a radical politics, there has to be what I call a metapolitical ethical moment that provides the motivational force or propulsion into political action. If ethics without politics is empty, then with the
It should be
political,
politics. Sorry.
politics without ethics is blind.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, he's citing Kant.
Yeah.
Which is brilliant, because Kant would be one of the great founders of liberal ontology, right? That we are all ultimately united in this radical individual task of reason. But what we've seen from these three thinkers is the task of reason giving and objection hearing and revising one's own commitments and always saying, but how can I see the face of the other who might tempt me as an enemy, right? How do I make that face of the other still signify, even if the enemy lurks? Well, we've got to create social spaces and social structures and social resistances such that the enemy becomes the adversary, that antagonism does not ever get eliminated, but we constantly, perpetually try to convert it into agonistic discourse. That's how we sustain democracy for Talese, by not eliminating but embracing the paradox for Mouffe, in light of the infinite demand of justice for Critchley. Too often we think it's a 4-year plan for solving the problems, which ends up making our political realities not reflective of the depth of human existence and the human condition. We end up all being, like high school kids running for class president because they've got a friend who has a friend whose dad knows Beyonce and I can get her to come play our homecoming. And then somehow we would have money for textbooks, right? It's the flat-footed and frankly insulting accounts that we get from the right and left in their attempt to maintain power, that these three thinkers are all in various ways, but I think of a piece in encouraging us to rethink. Now, does this tell me how to engage my friend on Facebook? No, but it at least makes it less easy for me to think that I can just block him, or that there's no cost in continuing to try to engage him. I can't rest easy in any direction. And so that right now seems to be progress from the passive nihilism that tempts me, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that, or I'll put it as a question, how does, what role does the ubiquitous political discourse that's inherently bad faith play out? Like, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Because I just imagining how familiar undergrad students are, and that you're in an upper level philosophy seminar,
Yeah.
that, you could get done with doing this and be like, oh man, I can see like democracy's worth cherishing or whatever. And then they turn on their phone,
Yeah.
and it's bad faith with algorithmic gasoline on it.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, I don't have a good answer. I can say what's troubling for me is if you take seriously these three thinkers, and there's plenty more, right? This is kind of just giving a through line. If you take these three thinkers seriously, what I think it does is calls one to task relative to their own community and their own discourse and their own practices, more so than it does obviously like give a way forward for how to then view or engage or strategically entertain those with whom one disagrees. And So that's kind of where I've tried to lean for my students is in my class, as probably predicted, a class called Radical Political Theory did not get fully peopled with a bunch of Trump supporting undergrads, right? So I've got, all the Democratic Socialist of America kids coming in to take the class. And so to my utter surprise, I've had to be the voice that says, look, I pretty much agree with you all on lots of stuff politically. But in this space, what it looks like to invite genuine reflection and genuine philosophical discourse about the political, I can't let DSA commitments stand as themselves obvious, sacrosanct, or unchallengeable. So I think they see me as this like neoconservative boomer that they have, all these problems with, despite the fact that
come on, you're not a boomer.
I'm a really cannot, I'm a Gen Xer, hard left in most ways. And yet, as a philosopher, I've got to invite them to recognize the problems of the status quo that infect us all. And so that's where the AI algorithm of bad faith for me happens. It's not just the bad faith of the structure, the bad faith of the leaders, the bad faith of the system that is moneyed and powered. It's also the bad faith of even those with whom we link arms, who act as if you're not linking arms with us, you are definitionally repugnant. Now, as we saw from Talise, well, what do we do when we really do see them as repugnant? Because a lot of people actually are. I don't know, right? And that's where I'm at right now is I'm trying to use my voice as loudly and as sustainedly as I can to rage against what I take to be the horrifying present that is threatening not just our specific democratic model, but the lives and flourishing of the globe's most marginal. But how do I do that in a way that doesn't just flip the script and claim we're the ones fighting the just war, though for what it's worth, I increasingly think that might be the right language. But in doing so, I've now given good reasons to the right to think that just war is required because look how risky I'm willing to become. And that's the horrifying part, right? Is that the bad faith is not just a them issue. It's always also an us issue. And this is why I love Levinas and Derrida and stuff who constantly are saying, look, you think you've got it all figured out? Awesome. Recognize that there is always another other.
Yeah.
You don't get to go to sleep with a good conscience. And for me, that might be not as social strategy, but it might be a kind of initial reminder that helps me get the energy I need to avoid nihilism a little bit longer. And that's where I'm at right now.
Well, one of the problems with our current moment, and I think this is significantly amplified by the volume of our relationships that are mediated by platforms that have colonized our subjectivity. But we have a culture that's increasingly deaf to the other, difference, negativity. And it seems that like part of what all three of these theorists kind of a feature of the present we need to address to get to have a renewal, right, of like the democratic dream is we need to find a way to reintroduce negativity and tension so that in our lives where we actually awaken to the other as other, right? Like in a space where listening becomes a possibility, not listening because it's experienced as just a judgment of you or as a demand for sameness, but for an event where otherness is not conquered or sublated or diminished or set aside, like finding out how to do that in a kind of digital panopticon that holds our attention longer, precisely by making the other monstrous and then valorizing the dismissal of their dignity. Even though I used to try
It
to
might,
talk myself down of the dismissal of their dignity and be like, this
yeah,
is just probably hyperbolic. And then Trump's kind of
it
like, hold
it
my
might
Diet
be
Coke.
warranted. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing that sucks, right? Is it when I think about this pastor with whom I find myself engaging more than, to be honest, I wish I were. Uh, we have the same alma mater. We have a shared history in certain ways. We've come from the same religious tradition and denomination, and that fact um, creates a sense for me that, look, when you say Trump represents biblical values, and I say, well, what values are those? It seems to me that X, Y, and Z are pretty far from any conception of biblical values I could think of, regardless of one's political commitments. And then, of course, the response is, which this is true, a link to a video that I did. I think it was with our friend Josh Patterson. Might have been a different podcast, but that was simply titled "Who the F is Kierkegaard?"
Yeah.
And his response to, I'm asking for reasons, man. Like, I want to think with you, because it's not that I am saying everything you suggest is dumb. I'm trying to say that the words you're using no longer have semantic traction, right? They don't mean anything if what Trump looks like counts as biblical values. The response was, for anybody seeing this engagement, I fully recommend that you go check out where Simmons actually stands, and puts a link to that podcast, which wasn't anything about Kierkegaard. It was just the fact that there was a cuss word in the title of the
Watch
podcast
out.
was somehow immediately anti-biblical. And of course, my response was, fantastic. I hope everybody goes and listens to this podcast, because if we are more offended by some language than we are by actual marginalization, actual, inhumanity to our fellow people, something's gone wrong. He recently posted a thing where he said, feminism is a great evil and ruining our society. And I responded and said, well, which feminism? There's lots of them. Be better at this. Maybe there are some versions that we should be rightly critical of. And the response was, I will stand unnuanced for God and Jesus and good. And I was like, man, like
I will
and so
stand
here's
unnuanced.
unnuanced,
That
right?
is
I'm like, dude, without nuance, here I stand. And
without
everything in me wants
nuance.
to say,
Here I stand.
just war, right?
Belligerently ignorant and proud of
Yep.
it. Yeah.
And yet what I think is, well, but every time I have those engagements, which my emotional response, my care about my own son, not letting this be what Jesus means to the world, like all these things make me just want to, throat punch this guy, right? And yet every time I try to engage, and I always will do 2 follow-ups. But don't you see, man, what you're saying now is kind of performing the thing I'm worried about. Surely we would want to think critically. If you're right about a certain political vision, then that would mean that you think there are really good arguments. But all I'm seeing is just really problematic proof texting. And it turns out that you're not giving any biblical hermeneutics as a frame by which that proof text could even stand up and bear the interpretation you're giving it. Let's do better at this, man. Let's actually model something else. And what happens every time is I will get anywhere from a dozen to 50 people telling me I'm a heretic and idolater and ruining the world, and my deconstructive Christianity I'll have to answer when I face God, and on and on and on and on and on. I've been accused of witchcraft and sorcery and everything. Yeah, it's impressive. I'm nowhere near as impressive as they think I am, right? It's like, man, if I could do half of that stuff, pew, 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 right? And yet every time I get at least one person I do not know reaching out on private message saying, thank you so much. I could never say that. I don't know how people stand and say these things, but unless we do, I just don't know what's going to happen to the world and our country and the church we love, right? So I've decided that I'm never actually talking to the person who is acting in bad faith. I'm talking to the fact that that bad faith engagement where I'm trying to be in good faith is being algorithmically deployed, right? In ways that are actually maybe inviting people to avoid whether active or passive nihilism in their own lives. And maybe that's all we can do right now, while we also protest, funding decisions and file lawsuits and stand together and have rally. Like, this isn't a this thing or nothing. It's do it all. 1,000 flowers in resistance. But it might be the case, especially for those of us that are engaged in political philosophy, that we start modeling discourse not for the person with whom we are speaking, but for the people who are watching us speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and I I tend to make a distinction between the the ideal type of discourse for democracy and
Mm-hmm.
um uh like thinking about discipleship and
Yeah.
what it looks like in the present, because a democracy, there's a social contract of some sort that were gifted in a sense by showing up here.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, at least if you're a disciple of Jesus, it seems that grace and obedience come in a single event.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I have a lot harder time at the claims that certain uses of institutional power at the political level
Mm-hmm.
are representative of the Jesus and the people who've been
Mm-hmm.
baptized into his body,
Mm-hmm.
then going like, all right, there are citizens that think this, and
Right.
so I I had a conversation with a friend who, he's like grew up very reformed and loves himself some Peter Thiel and things,
Mm.
and I mean, you can go ahead and guess what kind of things would come out of my mouth, and at some point,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until he made a claim, a theological claim of sorts, like, that I was just like, "No."
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
and
Can't
he
go
goes,
there.
"Well, Christians can blah, 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 blah," and I was like, "Yeah, Christianity is very clear that Christians see things wrongly. That's why we confess our sins every time we get together."
Right.
This is not like, that part's very, very clear. I was just like, I don't understand how, uh, you know, one's commitment to Christ
Mm-hmm.
turns into democracy and capitalism aren't compatible, therefore capitalism. I was like,
Yep.
Jesus only had one binary, and it was God or mammon, right? Like,
Yep.
and I said, I can understand conservative people who give, like, well, yes, we share this value as a Christian. This is the horizon I think the political sphere should address, and the church should address this. And there are all these kinds of things about it. And I can just be like, I think you're wrong. And if we wanted these shared outcomes, I think it gets done better this way or whatever.
Right.
And you could see a deliberative process. It's just the kind of claiming of the antichrist agenda is what God wants, where I'm just like, no, no,
Yeah.
I
No.
I was like, you have permission to turn
Yeah.
away and walk away sad. I just don't think you have like one where you get to rewrite the gospel where you're like, well, the rich young ruler had a point. You know what I mean?
What's like by our mutual friend John Sanders in his book Embracing Prodigals has this amazing retelling of the prodigal son story, where the whole idea is, the prodigal son comes back and his father's like, dude, you blew it. You have to work your way back into my good graces. You've got to prove to me that you're not the loser that you said that you showed yourself to be. I got no time for people who aren't successful. And he retells the prodigal son story in light of what we might call the kind of Trumpist evangelicalism
Yeah.
that so many people are now embracing. Um, and it is horrifying, right? The thing that I want to make sure that, I know we're coming to a close with our time, that I don't want people to misunderstand. Everything that we've been talking about, it is fair for somebody to come back and say, well, look, if this is a call for, more compellingly seeing the other, recognizing the face that exists no matter the political view, even when it comes to, we can't keep talking about this with theology because you're now, as we used to say in the academy, you're not even wrong, right? Like, if you're wrong on a paper, I can give feedback and show you a way to make it better. If you're not even wrong, I don't have anything to say, right? So many times it feels like I'm talking to people who just aren't even wrong. And so what I don't want people to think is that there's some encouragement by two white dudes, with PhDs sitting around saying, what we need in this world is for people to start talking to each other more often. Well, easy for us to say, because our bodies, our identities are not typically the ones at stake, being threatened, facing the real existential risk and harm that I think the power structure currently represents to so many of our friends. And as much as I want to say, yes, that is not only fair, but necessary as a challenge and a critique, right? So that our own conceptions of discourse don't get entrenched without hearing the challenge. I just don't know what it looks like if we take that critique to the step where then we say, so we are willing no longer to engage, no longer to talk, because I will stand on the social justice side against the political equality side, right? If we, again, eliminate that tension, then we lose the power of Corrie and Betsy ten Boom, who, Betsy dies in World War II as a result of the inhuman cruelty of the National Socialists. And she says to her sister Corrie before she passes away, after this is over, they will need us to help them recover their humanity, to restore themselves. Corrie thinks she's talking about all of the prisoners in the camp, all of the Jewish people surrounding them, right? And then she realizes, no, Betsy's talking about the soldiers. Like, she's talking about the Nazis. And I want somehow to maintain, on the one hand, and never forget the voice of the person that says, easy for you to say you're not at risk. And I want to stand with that person with every ounce of my being. And I also want to maintain that what Christianity reminds us is you stand with the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the oppressed, the marginal, unflinchingly. And you also recognize that each other is every other. Each other is wholly other. There is no point where it's turn the other cheek except when, right? Somehow that has to be also part of what pricks our conscience in a way that doesn't allow us to rest easy, to rest complacent, even when we are rightly standing for social justice. And that, again, we're not ending with so here we go, 3 steps for a better democracy. We're ending with, I think, a better sense of the tension that animates why this stuff is so exhausting and so hard.
Yeah.
And, to be honest, so risky. But it seems to me that maybe that's a better place to end because it propels us forward, right? And I think maybe that propulsion helps us overcome that nihilistic invitation and temptation that I know is ever creeping deeper into myself and my family and my existence. And that's when, this is the tricky part, that passive nihilism is the worst version of playing out my own privilege. I can become disengaged because I've got the social ability to do so. And that would be not standing for justice and therefore refusing to engage. That might actually be forgetting my own status, my own ability to speak, not for others, but to speak so that maybe their voices can now be heard a little bit better so I can speak less, right? Somehow that seems important. I don't have it figured out, but that's where I'm at right now. And yeah, if people think that this conversation was helpful in any sense, I would love to keep thinking with you, Trip, about what this would look like as a 6-week attempt to then maybe look at some of the more radical stuff. Let's actually read Schmidt together, which is political theology, right? Let's actually look at what it looks like when the Tarnac 9, these grad students come together and write The Coming Insurrection, which is about what would revolution demand and how do we bribe cops and ensure non-combatant immunity when you have to blow up railway stations. Like, that stuff scares me. That's not where I tend to go.
Really?
And yet I think I'll leave that to Dan Koch and Tim Whitaker, right? But it's got to be the case that there's some way to start engaging really radical stuff without therefore thinking that what radicality looks like is just justification of violence in the name of our own self-righteous notion of justice in the first place, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been fun.
Thank you,
always
man.
Good to
as
talk
always.
to you, Aaron.
Oh,
And
my goodness.
thank you, all of you that joined live. And I'm sure we'll get to do this again soon. because you
Hope
got
so.
the whole second half of the class. You
That's
you,
right.
you don't even know what's going to happen by the time you get done.
We might get to a Gombin and all of them, shift gears or change their minds. So yeah, we'll see what happens. We're moving now to Chantal Mouffe's book on a left populism
Hmm.
to see, well, what would it look like if populism returned to its kind of working class roots that were trying to stand against the sort of oligarchic tendencies that right now right-wing populism embraces. So we'll see
Yeah.
what that does, and then move on to, well, what comes next. And that's where
Hmm.
we're going to end the course and hopefully start a course with you at some point in the future. It'd be fun, man.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad I honestly, I just think it's impressive that you're going to get undergrad students to read a Agamben. This is, uh,
Well,
and the
I
first
should.
time I read Agamben, I was a PhD student, and I was just like
It's so
looking
hard.
around, when you come into the seminar, and I'm like,
Oh,
did everyone else get this the first time? Because The
yeah.
Scent of Time, that's what we read, and I was just like, I we'd already done like Jacob Talbot,
Yeah.
Zizek, Badu, and I was having this wasn't a problem. Then you get to
Mhm,
Agamben,
mhm.
and I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know if I'll pull off getting them to read him, though I will be assigning that they read
Yeah,
him. What's probably going to happen is that I get them to act like they have read him, and Chat GPT has told them enough about what reading him might convey that
watch
they
some
will
YouTube
sound,
videos about it.
yes, but passably aware. That's probably more what's going to happen.
All
So
right. Well, you know,
yeah, man.
then you can go to Baudrillard and talk about
Yeah, it's all a
simul
simulacra to
simu
begin with.
simulating a humanities degree.
We're not really here. That's right. Well, for everybody listening, would love to have you come check out my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. Connect with me over at YouTube at Philosophy Where We Find Ourselves, or you can get to all of that via my website, jaronsimmons.com. And as always, Trip, the work you're doing is important, and you model the kind of thing that I'm trying to figure out a way to do more effectively. So I appreciate your witness, man.
Well, I I'll take your compliments, and we'll put links on the podcast post if you're listening later,
I appreciate
so
that.
you